Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we have a program on Hughes aircraft history. We're at the historical Culver City facility for a retirees reception in the building where the Spruce Goose was built. We'll be interviewing some of the Hughes retirees who helped create the magic that was Hughes aircraft. For today's segment, I've invited George Merritt to be a guest interviewer. Let's go in and enjoy the event.
My name is George Merritt. I'm a retired test pilot from Hughes Aircraft Company, also the author of a book called Howard Hughes Aviator. Today I'm going to be interviewing one of the early members of Hughes Aircraft Company. His name is Justin O. Miller, goes by the nickname of Dusty, an old friend of mine who was employed with Hughes Aircraft Company in the early days of the formation of the company here in Culver City.
As you say, George, I was born in Trinidad, which was a British colony at the time, and I went to school in England, and I also was in the British Army and the British Air Force as an officer cadet, and then I went to Canada, and I was also in their Army and in their Air Force because the World War II was in process at the time.
Dusty, then your education was primarily as an engineer. Was that your field of study and interest?
Yes, I went to college at McGill University and took mechanical engineering prior to my departure for the United States and some work in the aircraft industries.
So after the war, now you're an educated engineer, and you had worked for a couple of aerospace companies before you came to work with Hughes Aircraft Company. How did you hear that there was a job opening at Hughes Aircraft?
Well, prior to that time, upon my graduation in Canada, I came to the United States and I worked for Douglas Aircraft, actually for Donald Douglas Jr. in experimental flight test, also as an engineer. And then subsequently I was in the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army, and following that assignment, which included a project at Hughes Aircraft, a guided missile project, I went to work for Hughes Aircraft, and primarily to conduct the flight tests on their Falcon Missile, an air-to-air missile.
The Falcon Missile was a very unusual project that was completed by Hughes Aircraft Company. It was kind of the first use of electronics in airborne missiles. So what part did you play in the design, testing, evaluation of the missile?
Well, during the time I was in the Air Force, I was in charge of that missile and the predecessor missile, and so they assigned me to the flight tests, launchings, of the Falcon Missile. And subsequent to that, I was engaged in a number of other projects with Hughes, including flight test of their aircraft and their airborne radar systems. And subsequently, I moved into other fields with Hughes. But during that time, I had some association with Howard Hughes and a great deal of association with some of his associates who were actually more notable than I.
Well, tell us a good Howard Hughes story. That's what we want to hear, a Howard Hughes story.
Well, I ran into Howard Hughes a couple of times, or rather, he ran into me. As you know, he was somewhat reclusive. On one occasion, I came in on a military aircraft, and when I hopped out, there was Howard Hughes sitting in front of me. I felt like a damn fool. Apparently, he expected someone more important than I to have arrived. However, as I say, I was more closely associated with some of his associates.
Dusty, that sounds very interesting. So tell us some of the associates of Howard Hughes and what they were like.
Well, as I say, they were somewhat notable personages. It was Darryl Zanuck, who was head of 20th Century Fox, I believe, at the time. I helped fly him to Palm Springs. There was Randolph Hearst's son and his wife, whom I helped fly up to their castle up north. And who else? There was Robert Cummings, who was an actor, and whose plane Howard rented, and I flew. I'm sure there were other, Noah Dietrich. We flew up to Arcalarius Ranch up north with his son. And I recall flying also with Al McDaniel, who was head of flight test at the time, in a de Havilland airplane. Another notable was Bob Mayhew, who was a close associate, although I don't believe he'd ever actually met Howard. And I helped him fly out to the East Coast and met he and his son, who ran the North Las Vegas operations and the various gold mines and associates that were in Las Vegas, including John Seymour, who was in charge of that operation. We used to call it riding the elephant's back. By riding the elephant's back, what we meant was that whereas we were somewhat, let's say, minions, these people were important people, and so to them we were the elephants whose backs we were riding.
Dusty, I think also some of the people that were around Howard Hughes were called pollywogs because they were always swimming around the big man. Did you meet any of his pollywogs?
Yes, we had some so-called pollywogs, and their job was to jump to attention whenever Howard Hughes needed some services. For example, he would need a hearing aid set up in any of his hotel rooms, and since he frequently changed his mind, they had to reserve accommodations in several different cities that he might wish to visit while he was in flight. I recall being at Santa Monica Airport when one day Howard decided he was going to take a trip by himself. And he climbed into the airplane in the dead of night, and the control tower operator told me his first intimation was that the lights of the aircraft went on, and the aircraft started to taxi out from Santa Monica, which was very close to the control tower. And he shot a red light into the cockpit to indicate that he was not to continue. And he said all he could see was Howard behind the column with the throttles pushed forward, and he disappeared into the night.
I agree with you. Howard was very unique, particularly here at Culver City. It was his runway, his field. He had a control tower operator, but he told the control tower operator what he was going to do. He didn't ask for permission, he just did it. So he was very, very unique. I guess we'd also be interested, Dusty, in some of the potential Hollywood stars that Howard was dating. Did any of them happen to pass through?
Yes, as a matter of fact, as you know, Howard was a real ladies' man and dated many of the beautiful ladies that many of us would have liked to date. And of course, one of them was Kathy Downs, who happened to live in an apartment next to mine. And she starred in a film called My Darling Clementine, and she played the part of Clementine. And I also dated her, but not, of course, with Howard. I'm sure that you know about many other young ladies he dated. As a matter of fact, I was speaking to a former co-pilot of Howard's, which of course is another story. And he said that the reason that he cracked up the F-11 was because he was buzzing one of his lady friends' houses. Um, so now, also as a matter of fact, he dated my secretary, whose name was Beverly Ghetto, who was also quite attractive. I also saw him out at a nightclub called the Doll House, and he was looking for girls, just as I was. And he was wearing that well-known jacket, his two-tone jacket that had been given to him by one of his producers.
Howard was not only in charge of his own runway, but when he went to other airports, he did exactly the same, which was to tell them what he was going to do, not ask them permission. And so one control tower operator said it was just like announcing a horse race. You just told what had happened with Howard, not what was going to happen. He also was very, very unique in the fact that he never carried money with him. He didn't like to spend money on anything extra. So when he flew, supposedly he got his maps from service stations, gas stations, which were free at the time. Dusty, did you ever see him looking around for a map?
No, I never saw him looking for maps, but I can recount some incidents that you seem to have touched on. I have a friend who flew with him as co-pilot, and they went in during the World War II, and he went into New Jersey Airport, which happened to be a military airport at the time, and promptly disappeared, telling him not to leave the scene. And so several months later, my friend took a course at New York University and eventually decided to return to Hughes and saw Howard. And Howard simply said, "Hi."
Howard Hughes was very unusual in that he was probably more of a night person than a day person. And so when he was dealing with his engineers and mechanics, a lot of the time it was at night. Dusty, did you ever have an experience with the, for example, XF-11 blueprints and group of people working in the evening?
Yes, one evening, well past midnight, there were half a dozen of us working on blueprints for the F-11 airplane. And one of the participants rustled his doggy bag to get Howard's attention, and Howard remarked that, "Oh yes," he says, "you must be hungry." And so as they filed out, he said, "Oh, I suppose you need some money." And so he gave them $5, and he said, "Now just because I gave you $5, don't think I don't want my change back."
Howard was also very unusual in that he liked to drive old Chevrolets. And the reason for the old Chevrolets and not carrying much money is that he didn't want to be kidnapped and robbed. So he felt that nobody would take an old automobile and nobody would rob him if he didn't have any money. Did you ever have any experience with his automobiles?
Yes, I saw him driving in and out on one of those old Chevrolets. As a matter of fact, Hughes had a lot of Chevrolets from Owen Keown Company in Santa Monica. And on one occasion, he came in there, and the entire side of the car was scratched up, and I believe that he simply drove it into his current abode, which at that time was Bel Air. And the car simply drove up against the nearest bush, and he really wasn't too concerned about that. And on one occasion, he came in his old Chevrolet, and the guard wouldn't let him in because he didn't have a badge. And I recall later on there was a sign put up in the guard shack with a photograph of Howard, and it said, "Admit this man without a badge."
So Dusty, a couple of years after the war, you were stationed out at Wright-Patterson as an engineer for the Air Force, and you were on a trip out to California because you were involved with managing the Falcon Missile that was built by Hughes Aircraft Company. And while you were in California, an incident occurred. Tell us about the incident.
Yes, actually it was a predecessor to the Falcon Missile. It was called Tiamat, and it was about 9 feet long and 18 inches in diameter, and it weighed about 300 or 400 pounds. And unfortunately, it fell off the launch aircraft, which was a B-25 bomber. And so, since I was in uniform, and since the Brewster hearings were in process, and they didn't want to have any further untoward publicity, they sent me out to try to placate the householder. It was a tract of which there was only one vacant lot. And this missile came down and skimmed the top of the last house and landed in the vacant lot. And I informed the householder that really she didn't have anything to worry about because it wasn't going very fast. She said, the hell it was. She said it was, I saw it coming down there like a bat out of hell. And so, at all events, we retreated in a certain amount of disorder. And there was actually an item in the Glendale newspaper that said, Butterfinger pilot drops missile on Burbank. And it was a picture of this missile sitting forlornly in the vacant lot.
Howard Hughes was also quite unusual in his toilet practices. Dusty, tell us of an unusual event that occurred with Howard.
Well, as you know, he was very meticulous. And at a certain point when he was renting a house in Bel Air, he decided that the toilets were not sufficiently comfortable. So he decreed that a number of toilets would be brought for his inspection, and they were dutifully laid out on the lawn in front of the mansion, while Howard tested each one of them, eventually selecting one that was comfortable to his satisfaction.
Dusty, you're also a rated pilot by the United States, so tell us about some of your flying with Hughes Aircraft Company.
Yes, I was a commercial pilot, and I had ratings for single and multi-engine land and sea instruments and helicopters. And while being in charge of the aeronautical section of flight test, which we can discuss later, I also flew some of the aircraft. One, as I say, belonged to Robert Cummings, which was a twin beach. We had some B-25 bombers that we used for targets for our test aircraft, which were interceptors. And so we had aircraft that we used to supply our test activities in Alamogordo. And so I flew many of these aircraft, or I was co-pilots in the aircraft. And that included a B-52 bomber. And of course we had Air Force crews that brought these aircraft out. And they had such a good time when they were here that very often it was difficult to prevent them from sending these aircraft. On one occasion we had to develop a special test program because we had more target aircraft than we could handle.
Howard Hughes purchased the land here in Culver City back in the 1940s in the interest of having a larger facility that he could make war products for World War II. He also needed a runway, and so at the time period it was strictly grass, and Howard flew off of the grass strip for many years. The grass strip was here when you joined Hughes Aircraft Company in '46. Tell us what you saw.
Yes, it was a grass strip, and sometimes difficult to maneuver because we often had floods in this area. And I might mention that there was a clump of trees about halfway down where Howard used to meet his girlfriends. Yes, I took off on a number of occasions. I had a small Globe Swift aircraft of my own, and I flew some of the other aircraft, such as the Twin Beach that was owned by Robert Cummings. And so we had many flights there, and there was a control tower on one side of the runway. And Subsequently, when Hughes had a number of heavier aircraft to test, such as the F-89 Scorpion, the aircraft were too heavy to use those runways. They would cut deep ruts in them. And so the aircraft was paved. I recall that there was 12 foot of decomposed granite put in before the concrete runway was laid on top. It was a very well designed and serviceable, in fact, the largest private aircraft runway in the world for many years. And that's where we did most of our flight tests. At one point we had about 35 test aircraft. My friend George Merritt has a full account of that in his book, including a description of each and every aircraft that were flown, which was, I would say, close to 100. At that time, I was in charge of the aeronautical engineering section. I had about 80 engineers to design the modifications to the test airplane. I pride myself on the fact that when I was in charge of the missile program, I was a buck private. And when I was in charge of the aeronautical engineering section, I had, as I say, 80 engineers, 4 of which were Annapolis graduates.
In the early 1950s, Howard Hughes became involved with a very unusual program, which was to build the largest helicopter that had ever been built. It was the X-817. It flew for about 10 hours, some 30 flights, all here at the Culver City runway. So Dusty, you heard about the airplane. What do you know about the X-817?
Well, I was in a hangar that was close to the building in which we are now located, then called the cargo building. And the helicopter, which I believe was actually built in this building, was taxied and tethered to a pad that was about a quarter mile west of here. And our co-pilot, our friend, co-worker, Gail Moore, was the only one who ever flew that airplane. Most of the flights were conducted with a tether. That is, there was a cord that was attached to the aircraft, so it could be flown, but only within a short radius. And it had 2 General Electric turbine engines that propelled the helicopter blades not in the usual way. It was propelled by a jet stream that was channeled through a tube and out through the ends of the blades in order to rotate the propeller blades, which lifted the aircraft. And instead of being rotating at a couple of thousand revolutions per minute, it only rotated about 180 times per minute. So it had a peculiar noise, whoop, 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 whoop. And as far as I know, the aircraft was never flown, at least not very far. But I'm sure you can get a full account from Gail Moore, who's still alive.
Today I'm interviewing Dusty Miller in what is called the cargo building. It's a huge wooden building that was built to build the parts and pieces of the Spruce Goose, the flying boat that was Howard's cherished little toy, as it turns out. It was built here and then trucked to Long Beach and assembled and flown. This building is still remaining after all of these years. It was built in about 1940, so it's looking like 70 years old. Dusty, the first time you came to the cargo building, tell us what it was like in your time.
My first visit to the building was round about 1947, when I was a project officer on the missiles, and I was being shown around by the chief honcho at the time, who was Glenn Odekirk, who was another notable associate of Howard Hughes. And at that time, the Spruce Goose, as it was later called, because it wasn't made out of spruce, had just been taken out of the building and taken down to its berth in Long Beach. And so Glenn Odekirk was showing me around the facilities. And the building was empty, but there were some jigs made out of plaster that were, I assumed, to be used in the production of any number of further flying boats. So I pointed out to him that these jigs should be kept in good repair. And I recall that he looked at me with some dismay, which I discovered later was because he knew that probably it was the only such aircraft.
In about 1952, Howard reluctantly paved the runway here. It was the Air Force that was pressuring him to do that because now they were operating jet aircraft. And jet aircraft off of dirt strip was not very good because of the ingestion of foreign objects. So reluctantly he did pave it. And what was it like to fly off of the paved runway?
Well, my best recollection of the paved runway was that on one occasion I was co-pilot on an Aero Commander aircraft, as I say, owned by William Randolph Hearst Jr. And we were taking the then current CEO, Pat Hyland, out to his place in Palm Desert. And as we taxied by the buildings, there were two buildings housing engineers and scientists at that time. And we fortunate ones had windows that looked out over the runway. And if there was anything of any interest, why, we would go to the window to see what was happening. On this occasion, I was on the runway, and I looked over to see a sea of faces in each of the windows of these two buildings, Building 5 and Building 12. I don't think they realized the scene they were creating from our point of view. But Pat Hyland, who had a good sense of humor, he said, well, he says, I'm sure glad to get out of that place. The other thing I learned, by the way, was that these people that I mentioned had privileges that most of us wouldn't think about. And so they were able to do things that we cannot do. They didn't have to go to the grocery. They didn't have to get their hair cut. Neither did Howard. So they could spend their time doing whatever they wished to do. And a bunch of acolytes would pick up all the pieces.
Dusty, you mentioned Glenn Odekirk, and Glenn was one of the probably first 10 employees that Howard hired. He was kind of a combination engineer and mechanic. He went on to build the H-1 Racer and was in charge of the flying boat, its construction. So what was Glenn Odekirk like?
Well, Glenn Odekirk was a very charming fellow. Among other things, he had a mansion on the top of Mulholland Drive. And he had so much land that he actually built himself a small airstrip alongside Mulholland Drive. And he invited me to come over and land my BT-13, which was an initial trainer in the Air Force. But I declined. And subsequently, as you say, he was also in charge of the flyboat construction. And he took me down there, and I recall that in order to get on board, you had to put on what they called loft socks. That is a pillow that went over your shoes so that you didn't harm any of the woodwork. And you had to put also a similar contrivance on your toolbox by Howard Hughes' direction. It also happened that there was a chase boat, a former torpedo boat, a 60-foot British-built Vosper torpedo boat that had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in it, which was over 1,000 horsepower, and it had a couple of Ford V8 engines for cruising purposes. And subsequently, he got the chief engineer, Ray Hopper, to make the chase boat available to me, because as you all know, it wasn't in, there was no need for it because there was only one flight. So it happened that the aircraft companies were running a contract for a rescue boat for the test companies that had flights going on in this area. And so they gave me the privilege of offering this boat on contract. I turned in a proposal for the boat to loiter there night and day with a crew of 3. And I turned in my application, which was strangely in charge of the Chief Plant Protection Officer of North American Aviation. And it transpired that the contract went to someone in Santa Monica who had a 50-foot sailboat.
Howard's real super baby of the 1940s has to be what he called the flying boat, was called by other people the Flying Lumberyard. It was called the Spruce Goose, none of the names that Howard liked. But it was the biggest airplane, certainly the biggest seaplane that was ever made. And it did fly one time on November 2nd, 1947, on a Sunday morning. It had taken quite a while to build it, a long time to assemble it, and it was going out on its taxi test. Dusty, what did you see that morning in Long Beach?
Well, yes, I did see the first flight. It happened that I was on another visit when I was in the Air Force, and we came in a C-47 aircraft, and we circled the area along with 30 or 40 other airplanes, and we're surprised, as everyone else was, that it actually took off. Actually, I was a little apprehensive because one of my friends had designed the flight control system, which was an electromechanical system, and it was extremely unreliable. So I hesitate to think what would have happened had it made a longer flight.
After Howard Hughes flew the flying boat / Spruce Goose the one time, it was put back to bed, but everybody expected that it would fly again. But time went on, and it was still kept in Long Beach, and the official government in Long Beach was not very happy to have the airplane sit there. And so they were taking efforts to get rid of it. So Howard needed to do something to maintain the airplane in Long Beach. What did he do?
Well, I was a co-pilot on one of the aircraft belonged to Robert Cummings, and the Twin Beach. And so they sent me up along with a lawyer to lobby in Sacramento for him to be allowed to continue use of the flying boat in Long Beach Harbor. That is, they had a hangar for it over the water. And as George indicated, the Long Beach people didn't want to continue it, and so they had this lawyer go up and lobby for his lease to be continued. And at the same time, he lobbied for or against some offshore oil royalties that Long Beach had been expecting. And so it transpired that the appropriate officials decided that it was okay for Howard to continue to lease that hangar.
In the early 1930s, Howard entered a race in Florida and won what was kind of called a sportsman race with a modified airplane. But he wasn't very happy with the performance, and Glenn Odekirk told him, the only way you can get the kind of airplane that you want, Howard, is to build it from scratch. And so Howard said, by gosh, I will. And so that was the start of the H-1, the racer or the silver bullet, the mystery airship that was built back in the mid-1930s. Howard was planning to take it back to Cleveland on the air race there, but couldn't get it accomplished, couldn't get it finished in time, so he decided instead to take it down to Orange County and see if he could set a world speed record. So he did, in fact, in September of 1935, he set a world speed record by making multiple east-west, west-east passes, and ended up at an average of 352 miles per hour, which was a world record at that time period. The airplane then really kind of sat there for some period of time. It had the short wings, the speed wings on, and Howard decided that he now wanted to set a transcontinental record, but he needed longer wings, so it took a while for that to be built. Eventually, he did end up with about a 40-foot wing, and I think it was in about January of 1938 he flew nonstop from Burbank to Newark, New Jersey, and set a transcontinental speed record. The airplane was then ferried back to California and was stored at the Hughes Aircraft Company plant. And prior to the Spruce Goose, the H-1 was his baby. That was really his baby. He wanted that taken care of. And so it was kept in a Quonset hut next to the flight test division, and a fellow by the name of Bruce Burke was the caretaker of all of Howard's airplanes that he owned and were scattered all over the United States. Dusty, did you ever get a chance to see the H-1 racer?
Yes, as I mentioned, we flight test people worked in a hangar that was just across the road from Loyola College, and there was a creek that ran through there, and we were on the one side of the creek, and there was a Quonset hut on the other side, and Bruce Burke was in charge of the racer. And of course we went over there quite often to have lunch and whatever, and the airplane was actually rather unusual in that it was the first airplane ever to have flush rivets on the skin, and I believe the first airplane to have a retractable landing gear. But other than that, it was just sat there like it was in a museum. And Bruce Burke was another trusted friend of Howard's.
For about 10 years, Dusty was head of the Aeronautical Engineering Department of the Flight Test Division. So he was responsible for all the modifications that were done to both military and company-owned airplanes that were used as test beds. However, sometimes Dusty got to fly on special missions for which we can now talk a little bit about. There was a time period when he was asked by Bob Dodson, one of the company pilots, to join him on a flight. Tell us about that unique experience, Dusty.
Well, he says, Dusty, I want you to put on your flying togs and get hold of an airplane and have a IMO camera installed on it. That was a 35 millimeter camera. And then he said, I want you to meet me over at LAX and take some movies. So I said, Bob, you don't need me. You need, I said, I can get the camera put in the airplane, but I said, you need a photographer. No, he says, I want you to do it. So I dutifully did, and I met him over at LAX. And then he flew up to Hoover Dam. And then he made several dive bombing approaches on Hoover Dam. That means he put the flaps down and he put the gear down and he dove down like a scuba bomber at a 45-degree angle, and he told me to hit the button for the camera, which I dutifully did. And subsequently, I used to ride to work with Bob Dodson, and I complained to him about all sorts of things that they asked us to do when we were, as I said, riding the elephant's back. And he said, well, what's your complaint? I said, well, remember the time that you flew me up to Hoover Dam? I said, and what was that for? He says, well, we were making a movie for the John Wayne film, Jet Pilot. I said, but I saw the movie and I didn't see any shot of that. He says, well, unfortunately, there was a little scratch on the film, and so we couldn't use it. So I said, Bob, well, I told you should have a photographer.
While Howard Hughes was very active in the airplane business, he was also in the movie business. He owned RKO, and so he split up his time between flying and the movies. And it wasn't uncommon for movie stars to arrive here at the Culver City facility to fly out in one of the airplanes. Who did you see, Dusty, that ever arrived here at the plant to go flying?
Well, I remember seeing Clark Gable. The thing that impressed me most was what a huge guy he was and how powerful. And the next thing that I found to be notable was that he had a beautiful Mercury Convertible. It was white, and it had red upholstery. And what really thrilled me was I looked at the ownership certificate, which in those days was strapped to the steering column. And it said, Gable, Clark, 310 Maple Drive, Beverly Hills. And it really brought home to me that there was a real guy called Clark Gable, you know. But as I say, there were a number of notables, and he was one of them that was showing up at Culver City.
Dusty, you ran into Charles Lindbergh, the first one to fly solo across the Atlantic. Tell me about the occasion when you first met him.
Yeah, he came to lunch with us over at the executive dining room, which was about a couple of 100 feet from where we now sit. Big, tall, lanky guy. I had met him a few years earlier in Trinidad. He was coming back from Africa from a trip in a Lockheed Electra float plane. I was a small boy in a small boat, and I rode out next to his airplane, and he was standing on the float, and the first American I ever heard speak. And he was being in discussion with one of the local mechanics. And the mechanic asked about a trapdoor that was in the float. And Lindbergh said, yeah, he says, that's where we used to store our anchors. He says, I lost one of them in Africa. So I only have one left. So that was a couple of contacts I had with Charles Lindbergh. I'm sure you know more about him than I do.
While this facility was owned by Hughes Aircraft Company, and there were airplanes that were owned by Howard, some of the employees kind of took it upon themselves to fly their own personal airplanes in to land here, commuting back and forth to work or for whatever reason. Dusty, did you ever have an airplane that you could bring in and land at the field?
I had a small airplane called a Globe Swift, and I had an office in one of the buildings that overlooked the runway. And I normally kept it at Santa Monica, but I had freedom to bring it here whenever I wanted because I knew all the people in the flight test community. We used to call it the Hughes Country Club. And next to my office there was a senior scientist by the name of Nate Hall, who had rented another small airplane, an Coupe, which was a very basic airplane. And one weekend, he came in and parked his Coupe in front of the control tower, which is where my airplane usually was. The following Monday, he came in and he says, Howard called and told me to get my airplane the hell out of here. Wanted to know how come his airplane is on my airfield. So he said to me, Dusty, how do you get away with it? I said, well, Nate, it's just in who you know. But of course, Howard just didn't catch me.
In 1957, after Noah Dietrich and Howard Hughes kind of parted the ways, the fellow that kind of came in to replace him was a Lockheed engineer by the name of Jack Reel. And Howard and Jack first met each other when they were involved with the Connie. As time went on, Howard took a close liking to Jack Reel, and essentially Jack told me one time, he said, I work for Howard Hughes at night and Lockheed in the daytime. Lockheed didn't mind it because they were hoping to sell airplanes to Howard Hughes because he owned TWA. So for many, many years, there was a close relationship with Howard Hughes and Jack Reel. He became his man to get him out of trouble, to help with finances, to help get loans, to get dates for him, you name it. Jack Reel was there. It was one of the closest personal friends. Did you, Dusty, ever get a chance to meet Jack Reel?
Yes, I want to tell you about one more story. It's about Jack Reel, who was said to be Howard's closest and longest friend. As a matter of fact, he was with him when he came back from Mexico. And he also took Howard over to England to fly some of their de Havilland aircraft. And I think it's certainly featured in Jack Reel's book about Howard Hughes. And I had lunch with him one day, with Jack Reel. And I said, Jack, I've heard a lot of stories about you. And he said, yep. He says, I've made up a lot of them myself.
We want to thank Dusty Miller for all of the stories that he's told us about of the early time at Hughes Aircraft Company at Culver City. It's a rich and glorious history that we didn't want to lose as part of our museum activities. So we've taken this opportunity to interview him and hear his history of that time period.
I'm here with Ken Richardson. Ken, what were the years that you worked for Hughes Aircraft, and what was your role?
I arrived here in 1952 as part of the fellowship program, which was a mechanism the company used to attract people from universities. I started work as a radar design engineer, and over the years I progressed mostly due to blind luck and retired as president in 1991.
What's it like to be back here at the Culver City facility?
It was very exciting to see again these facilities, which are designated as a California Historic Site, and the Ratkovich Company is doing an excellent job in bringing them all back to life, all 11 buildings. It also is exciting to see some of the people that we teamed with to do the things that the company did. We were rated really as a national treasure. And to see these people again, who were dedicating their hearts to our mission and succeeding in creative technology, is a real wonder again. And it makes the heart throb to come back.
It's also exciting to hear some of the Hughes aircraft artifacts are being collected for a museum.
I think history can be preserved in many ways. One, of course, is preserving these buildings and making them an historic site, as has been done with many other buildings around the world. Another is to find a way to store and display the artifacts. This company actually became the electronics source for aerospace. We had between 1,200 and 12,000 products, depending on how you number them. We conquered every part of the electromagnetic spectrum, so there was nothing we could not do. Many of those things are set world records, and we should restore those artifacts and put them on display. The Western Museum of Flight in Torrance has a plan to build a new building and display many of these artifacts. Some of them are resident in Raytheon Corporation. It's possible they will make a loan of these, and others are actually stored in people's homes, and those are being solicited and will be gathered. I think that's going to be a marvelous display of the artifacts of things that we created.
In your book, Hughes After Howard, you captured the magic that is Hughes aircraft. Can you talk about that?
As mentioned previously, there are many ways to record history. One is by preserving the buildings, another is displaying the artifacts, and a third is to record the history in writing. With the help of 90 other people and 4 years of effort, this book has been created. And yes, the idea is to capture the magic of what it is that we did. There's very seldom any other way that you can do that.
Thank you, Ken, for helping to make Hughes aircraft a national treasure and preserving its history to inspire future generations.
Indeed, it was a privilege. I was very, very fortunate to be able to be a part of this company, and it should not be forgotten, not just to inspire the future, but as a tribute to these people that worked together so hard to make all these wonderful things happen.
I'm here with Tom Carvey. And what was your role at Hughes, and when did you work there?
Well, it started in 1948 when I got out of the Navy and all, and in those days it was starting off with guided missiles. And we were trying to protect bombers from other attacks with guided missiles. And it ultimately developed, of course, and went from there into all kinds of electronic and space systems activities.
I understand you're one of the first residents of this building. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yes, this was known as the cargo building because of the big airplane, the cargo liner, and it's all wood. So when they told us we were going to be stationed here, we were the propulsion department, so they could put us out here away from the electronics. But we first decided we needed fire escapes, and we had to, the offices were all internal. They had no windows. It was completely dark on the inside if the electricity failed. So we ended up having to build steps, escape steps on the outside of the building, and to put in emergency lighting and things of that sort. And of course, we ultimately occupied the building for many years in that regard.
Can you share one of your memories here at Hughes Aircraft?
Well, I think of one here in this building, this cargo building, early on when I was just a kid engineer, of watching Howard Hughes himself taxi an airplane in and out of the building. In those days, it was unusual for commercial airliners to have reversible pitch propellers, because the idea was that if anything could go wrong, it would ultimately go wrong. But Howard Hughes, I think, felt that that was going to be an asset. And he took a Convair 240 out here in the hangar and spent the entire day. First, he would taxi it out of the hangar, then he would reverse the pitch of the propeller so it would reverse, and he could back the airplane back into the hangar. And he had his sandwiches and milk up in the cockpit with him. And, that was a fun thing to be able to witness.
Could you share with us how Hughes Aircraft got into the space industry?
Well, it wasn't easy. We had to compete against, the best that there was in the world. And the most significant program that we competed for was the Surveyor program, the one that made it possible to soft land a vehicle on the surface of the moon. In those days, we didn't know whether you could do that or not, whether the moon was covered with dust and you'd sink into it or what. So no one had ever soft landed any vehicle on the moon. So this was an enormous program with NASA that we won, and with the help of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that managed it, we successfully landed 5 of these spacecraft on the moon. Very sophisticated, obviously, in all respects, with the electronics, the power systems, the rocket motors that landed it, and all, and plus the instruments then that showed what the surface of the moon was like and would prepare the way for the Apollo program.
What made Hughes Aircraft a very special place to work?
There was enormous sense, I think, of team effort, that people worked together, and it took so many different technical disciplines to succeed in many elements of what we were doing. Very complex, very challenging, forefront of technology and all that. But I think one of the absolutely key elements in Hughes was a sense that if a problem occurred, you fix the problem, not the blame. And that meant that if a problem occurred, you were free to talk about it. You could work the solutions. You could call upon people throughout this company, which had incredible resources technically, to be able to proceed to the next step. And that ability to deal with problems, not bury them, not cover them up, face them forthrightly, get on with it, solve the problem, and then create something better next.
Is there something you'd like to add?
Well, there were so many different technical disciplines going on at Hughes, whether in the missile business or the space and communications business, the ground systems, radars. It was incredible, the variety of elements and of the technology that was taking place. So that it was incredibly stimulating at all times. I do think that there was one thing, again unique, in the sense of integrity of the company. That if we had a problem, we would deal with it, we would take the responsibility for it, and we would go forward from there. And so the technical excellence was one thing, but the ability to apply it with integrity and responsibility was a key element to everything I ever knew and existed and learned and lived with at Hughes.
Thank you, Tom, for sharing your memories of Hughes Aircraft. Thank you for joining Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.